The rain had been falling for 11 days when Sergeant Dara Reyes found the thing in the rubble of Sector 9. It wasn't the rain that surprised her. After the Tlaloc fleet had parked itself in the upper atmosphere and begun its atmospheric suppression campaign, rain was all anyone got. It fell in silver curtains at 2 in the afternoon and in black sheets at midnight. It seeped through the emergency shelters. It warped the plywood barricades. It pooled in the trenches outside the checkpoint at Kala Tacuba until the mud was waist-deep and the sentries stood in it with the blank eyes of men, trying very hard not to think about what they were standing in. The rain didn't surprise her. What surprised her was what the rain had uncovered. The building that had been the Museo de Antropología e Historia's satellite annex had taken a plasma strike sometime in the first week of the siege. The upper floors had pancaked down and the rubble had compressed itself into something almost geological, layers of concrete and rebar and shattered exhibit cases, and the scattered bones of things that had lived and died 1,000 years before the Tlaloc ever entered the solar system. 3 days of sustained rain had worked at the debris field the way a river works at stone, patient, personal, indifferent to outcome. And what the water had found, working its way down through all those compressed centuries, was a corridor. And at the end of the corridor, in a room that shouldn't still have existed, was the statue. Reyes had been clearing the sector for survivors, though survivor was a generous term at this point. She'd found 11 bodies in the previous 6 hours, plus the left arm of a 12th person, which she'd catalogued and left. She was tired in a way that had moved past physical exhaustion into something resembling a philosophical position. She was tired the way stone is tired, or the way water is tired, which is to say she simply continued. She had her rifle. She had her helmet's low-light feed. She had the earpiece, through which Lieutenant Cabrera periodically reminded her to stay in radio contact, and through which she periodically told him she was still alive. And neither of them said anything about the people who were not. She came down into the flooded corridor alone, water to her shins, and the light in her helmet swept across shattered case after shattered case. Obsidian blades scattered across the floor like a fever dream of broken glass, ceramic figures half submerged, textiles dissolving into the murk. She swept her light along the far wall and stopped. It had fallen from whatever platform it had once occupied, and now sat upright on the floor as if it had always meant to be there. Rain God reclining the old form, knees bent, torso tilted back, the flat tray of the abdomen facing upward, as if offering something to whoever stood before it. The stone was dark with age and water, and something that looked in the low light almost like pigment, ochre and deep red, old enough that she couldn't tell if it was paint or mineral stain or the memory of both. The head was turned to face her. She stood there for a moment. Water moved around her boots. Somewhere above, through layers of concrete and 52 meters of atmosphere, the Tlaloc harvester vessels were running their collection loops, pulling moisture from the air in complex, beautiful spirals that human meteorologists had spent 3 weeks trying and failing to model. Down here in the dark, Reyes looked at the statue and the statue. She knew this was her exhaustion talking. She was aware of that, looked back. "You're a long way down," she said. Her voice sounded wrong in the corridor, too flat, absorbed by the water and the wet stone. She sent a location ping in the coordinates of the room, tagged it as a cultural site requiring recovery, and kept moving. She didn't think about it again until the statue came back to her on a truck. The order had come down through channels so convoluted that, by the time it reached Reyes, it had lost any trace of its original human author and, read-like policy, cultural materials of pre-Columbian origin recovered from Sector 9 were to be consolidated at Command Post Tenochtitlan, sublevel, pending assessment of their condition and potential strategic value. Strategic value, Reyes had read, and then read again, and then filed. With all the other things she was choosing not to examine too carefully, she signed for the statue with the same pen she used to sign requisitions for rifle lubricant and field rations. And the truck left, and the statue was installed in the sub-level she shared with 12 other survivors of the 3rd Combat Engineering Battalion in the corner between the emergency generator and the water recycler. Because there was no other space, the sub-level was underground. Of course it was. Everything at Command Post Tenochtitlan was underground. They were 52 meters below street level, in a system of tunnels originally built for the expansion of Metro Line 12, purposed and reinforced after the initial Tlaloc strike had made surface occupation impossible. The recycler was always running. The walls wept condensation. The floor drains worked about half the time. At any given hour, there was between 1 and 4 centimeters of standing water somewhere in the room, traveling in slow rivers, along the grout lines between the floor tiles, pooling in the low corner near the generator, working its way toward the statue's base with the patient purposefulness that water always showed. Private Mateo Quispe, who was 19 and from Cusco, and had survived the siege of the Benito Juarez International Terminal, by eating glucose tablets and reading philosophy, was the first one to say it. "It's looking at us. It's stone," said Corporal Valentina Reyes. No relation to the sergeant, just another coincidence in a war full of them. Stone doesn't look, this one does. Nobody argued with him, because nobody was willing to stand in front of it long enough to check. The statue had survived the plasma strike and the building pancake and 11 days of atmospheric saturation and the ride across Sector 9 on the bed, truck without a crack in it. The stone was not granite or basalt or anything Reyes could easily classify. It was a deep brown gray that shifted, in color depending on the light source, going almost amber under the warm LEDs they'd strung across the ceiling and very nearly black under the cold glow of the emergency panels. The figure was perhaps 1.5 meters from foot to crown. The face was broad, the features stylized but specific. This had been carved by someone who had a face in mind, a particular set of proportions, a particular quality of expression that was not quite serene and not quite threatening, but something in between, that the sculptor had known how to render and that Reyes could recognize but not name. The rain didn't stop. Outside and outside was a theoretical concept at this depth, more of a direction than a place. The Tlaloc continued their harvest. Their technology worked on a principle that human scientists had had approximately 3 weeks to study before the grid went down, and the scientific infrastructure of the northern hemisphere largely ceased to function, but the working understanding was this. The Tlaloc were a species that had evolved in an environment of extreme atmospheric moisture, and they found Earth's weather chaotic and insufficient, and so they were fixing it in the way that any sufficiently advanced civilization fixes problems, which is to say systematically and without consultation. They were improving the rain. They were making more of it. The flooding in the sublevel got worse. Maintenance ran the pumps. Maintenance ran the pumps again. The pumps began to fail in a sequence that was not random. Sergeant Hector Villanueva from engineering pointed this out on the third day, standing at the junction box with a diagnostic reader and an expression of deep professional offense. Pumps were failing in order of installation. Oldest first. Something about the moisture content in the air was accelerating the oxidation of the housings, corroding the seals, eating the copper contacts in the relay boards. They patched and replaced and rerouted, and the water continued to find the lowest point in every room. And the lowest point, in the sublevel, was the corner with the generator and the water, recycler and the statue. Nobody moved the statue. This was a decision they made collectively and never discussed. It would have been easy to move it. It was heavy, but 8 people could manage it, and there was a storage room at the far end of Corridor C that was drier and darker and would have been more appropriate. Nobody went to get the dolly. Nobody suggested getting the dolly. They left it where it was, in the wet corner, and they arranged their lives around it. Reyes started keeping a log. She'd always kept operational logs. It was part of the job, the documentation of decisions and actions and resource states, the ongoing translation of experience into something that could be transmitted and assessed. But this log was different. She started it on the 6th day of the statue's presence in the sublevel, and she didn't tell anyone she was keeping it, and she wrote in it on her personal tablet after the overnight watch changed and the sublevel was as quiet as it got. She wrote, "The Tlaloc don't understand what they've done by coming here. Not strategically, not technically. They've run the numbers on our defensive capacity and our resource supply and our probable command decisions, and they know, within acceptable margins of error, how this ends. What they haven't run the numbers on is this: we make things. We have always made things. We built the pyramids, and the cathedrals, and the metro tunnels, and the museum that stood above this sublevel for 120 years. And the things we make outlast us. The things we make remember us. The Tlaloc are harvesting our atmosphere, and they think they're taking something we need. They don't know we've been sitting in the dark with our dead before. We do that. It's one of the things we do. She didn't tell anyone about the log. She kept writing. On the 9th day, Private Quisp began to bring the statue offerings. The first was a ration bar, the chocolate variety, which was the most coveted type, and which Quispy had been hoarding in a sock in his kit for 3 days against a moment of sufficient desperation. He placed it on the flat stone tray of the abdomen, the receptor plate, the altar surface, the thing the statue had been designed to receive, and stood back, and Corporal Valentina Reyes watched him from across the room with an expression, someone trying very hard to decide whether to laugh or to report this. "What are you doing?" she said, leaving something. "For the statue. Yes. It's a statue, Quisp." "I know." She watched him for another moment. "What do you think it's going to do?" Quisp looked at the statue. The flat amber-colored light from the LEDs fell across the broad stone face and the extended reclining form, and the flat surface of the abdomen where the chocolate ration bar sat in its dull wrapper. "I don't know," he said. "Maybe nothing. But my grandmother used to say that you leave something before you ask for something. It costs nothing, and you've lost nothing if it doesn't work." Valentina Reyes looked at the ration bar. She had her own grandmother from Oaxaca, something almost identical, about leaving bread for the dead on the 1st of November, and she had stopped believing it at age 15, and then started believing it again at age 31, which was when her mother died, which was a year before the Tlaloc arrived. She said, "What are you asking for?" Quisp was quiet for a moment. "For us to figure it out," he said. "For they do." She went back to her maintenance report. The ration bar stayed on the stone tray. Nobody took it. By the 12th day, there were other things on the altar. A folded photograph, a small ceramic figure of a dog that Corporal Ignacio Peck had carried in his chest pocket for 2 years. A handwritten note in Spanish that nobody could read because it was in handwriting too small and too private to be read without permission. Someone had woven a length of copper wire into a ring and left it against the statue's knee. Someone had left a pressed marigold, dry and flat, that must have been carried in someone's kit for weeks. The orange color dulled to a deep amber that was almost brown. Reyes wrote about this in her log. She wrote, "I thought it would embarrass me. The offerings, the folk religion of the frightened, but I've been watching them leave things, and I think I was wrong about what it is. They're not asking for magic. They're asking for continuity. They're saying, we were here, we made this. Someone made this. Someone sat in front of a piece of stone, with a tool in their hand and thought carefully about the angle of the knee, the proportion of the torso, the turn of the head, and they worked for how long? Months? Years? And then it was done. And they left it. And it was still here 1,000 years later, when we came down into the dark to hide from something that wants our sky. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot." She paused, and then she wrote, "B, the face is changing." She crossed that out. She wrote it again. "The face is changing. I know how this sounds. I know the light in here is inconsistent, and that I am operating on an average of 4 hours of sleep over the past 11 days, and that the human brain in a state of extreme stress is not a reliable instrument. I also know what I saw when I came in from the overnight watch." The quality of the expression on the stone face was different, not the features. The features are unchanged. I have photographs from the first day. I have compared them. But the expression reads differently now. It was in between things before. Not threatening, not serene, just somewhere in that large and nameless territory between. It is something I can almost name. I think it is waiting. The breakthrough didn't come from a lab. It came from Quisp. He was 22 hours into a double watch, reading by hand torch because the main LEDs in his section had gone out. Sitting with his back against the wall 3 meters from the statue, he fell asleep and woke up to find he was not alone. He described it afterward in a report that command circulated without comment, and then classified, and which Reyes read 3 times, because she was trying to understand whether it was real or whether Quispy had experienced something psychological, and which she ultimately classified in her own mind as probably real, and possibly both at once. What Quispy described. He woke up with the sensation of pressure in the air, the feeling of a storm approaching. The statue was unchanged. There was something in the room with him. Not visible, not touchable, but present in the way that a sleeping person is present, the way you can tell in the dark that you are not alone. He sat very still. He was aware of being studied. Not measured, not assessed, not profiled by instruments or sensors. Studied in the way that the very old study the very young, with an attention that has outlasted urgency. Then the pressure eased. Then he was alone again. Then he went to find Sergeant Reyes. It wasn't threatening, he said. She could tell he was choosing the word carefully, testing its accuracy. I need you to understand that. It wasn't anything bad. It was more like, he stopped, started again. You know how it feels when you pick up something very old and you can feel that it's old? Like old metal or old stone. The weight of it, the density. It felt like being looked at by something with that kind of weight. Reyes was quiet for a while. Did you feel any? No, I didn't finish. Gonna ask if I felt dominated or controlled or if I felt compelled to do anything against my will. No, I didn't. I just felt seen. He said the last word with the slight embarrassment of a soldier using the vocabulary of therapy in a tactical debriefing, and then he squared his shoulders and held it. That's the accurate word, seen. She filed the report. She also spent the next 6 hours sitting in front of the statue herself, waiting. Nothing happened. Or something happened that she couldn't consciously register. She was aware, in the vicinity of the statue, quality of attention that she didn't feel elsewhere in the sublevel. It might have been the acoustics. The corner with the generator created a particular kind of sonic envelope. It might have been the low-level electromagnetic field from the generator itself. It might have been what Quispy had described. She wrote in her log. The Tlaloc have been up there for 41 days. In 41 days they have achieved atmospheric control over 6 major population centers, have neutralized our orbital defense grid, have reduced our communication infrastructure by approximately 70%, and have begun the systematic restructuring of our upper atmosphere. Their intelligence is, I don't have a word that's good enough. Is extraordinary. It processes at timescales and scales of simultaneous consideration that we cannot match. We have known this since the first contact event. It's why we've been losing. Here is the thing I keep returning to. They study us the way a geologist studies rock, as something inert that will yield its information if sufficient force is applied. They are not reading us. They are reading about us. They look at our cities and our weapons and our organizational structures, and they model us forward and backward with high accuracy. What they cannot model, and I think this is true, I think this is actually true, is what we make, not the technology. They understand the technology fine. I mean the statue. I mean the photograph Quispy left on the altar, and the copper ring, and the dried marigold, and whatever is in that folded note that I will never read because it is private. They cannot model devotion. They cannot model the specific human madness of making something so beautiful that your descendants leave it offerings 1,000 years later in the dark. I don't know what we do with that yet, but I'm starting to think it's something. The plan was Reyes's, and she called it a stage operation, which was not quite accurate, but was accurate enough. What she needed, access to the Tlaloc sensor array that was running continuous atmospheric monitoring over the city grid. What the array was doing, measuring moisture levels, air pressure, particle density, all the inputs the harvesters needed to run their collection loops. What the array's one significant vulnerability was, it had been designed for a planet with no significant pre-existing infrastructure, and it was running its readings through a low-frequency carrier wave that happened to overlap with the resonant frequency of the metro tunnel network. The tunnels were acting as an antenna. The signal was detectable and partially legible from underground. And if the signal was legible, be interrupted. And if it was interrupted in the right way, at the right moment, when the harvesters were mid-cycle, the math was Villanueva's. He did it in 2 hours on a battered tablet with a cracked screen, sitting on the floor with his back against the generator, housing. And when he was done, he looked up at Reyes with an expression that was not exactly, but was in the same neighborhood. If we spike the carrier at peak collection, we don't crash the harvesters, he said. But we blind them. 30, maybe 40 seconds of sensor blackout. They'll be drawing atmosphere with no targeting data. They'll pull back, recalibrate. Yes, here's the thing. He turned the tablet around. During the blackout, we get a narrow window where the cloud layer is unmanaged. The harvester wake turbulence has been building this pressure gradient for 6 weeks. He traced the diagram with his finger. If we hit it at the right point in the cycle, we don't just blind them. We collapse the gradient. It's like letting the pressure out of a hose too fast. The moisture they've been aggregating comes down all at once, everywhere, in maybe 3 minutes. Too fast, too dense, too chaotic for their system to recover from before the collection loops lose coherence. Reyes looked at the diagram. We make it rain. We make it rain very, very hard for about 3 minutes. And while their entire atmospheric array is trying to recover from an uncontrolled discharge event. We come up, Reyes said. Villanueva nodded. How much can they compensate? Some. They're good. But they designed this system for stable conditions. They designed it to manage our weather, not to fight it. He looked at his numbers. They've never been hit by a rainstorm they didn't build. Reyes looked at the plan. She looked at the numbers. She looked at the diagram of the pressure gradient and the carrier wave frequency and the narrow 30-second window and the 3 minutes of uncontrolled discharge that would follow. She thought about something her grandmother had said about the storms in Veracruz, about how the coast people had learned to read the pressure changes 2 days out and had built their houses to survive what the foreigners couldn't see coming. She thought about Quispy's description of being seen by something with weight. She thought about the stone face in the corner, with its quality of expression that she could now almost name. She said, we need to hold the tunnel mouth for the full 3 minutes. While their array is down, they're going to push surface units. Yes. Do we have 14 functional infantry, 2 rail-mounted heavies, and 1 very large rain god? She looked at him. I'm not saying we bring the statue, Villanueva said. I'm saying, he paused. I don't know what I'm saying. I just feel like it should be there. We do it from. Reyes was quiet for a moment. That's not the most tactical thing you've ever said. No. Set it up, she said. We go in 48 hours. The 48 hours were the kind of time that compresses and stretches. Reyes wrote in her log twice, was unlike her. She was a once-a-day writer, had been since she started. The first entry was tactical, a record of the plan and the personnel assignments and the equipment states. The second entry she wrote at 3 in the morning, sitting in front of the statue in the near dark with a hand torch aimed at the ceiling. She wrote, I've been thinking about what the Tlaloc don't know about rain. They invented it. Or the version of it that's been falling on this city for 6 weeks, they did. They understand precipitation at a level of technical resolution that we won't match for decades. They can make it start and stop. They can control the droplet size and the distribution and the charge and the temperature. They make very good rain. But they didn't grow up in it. They didn't stand in the doorway of their grandmother's house in Veracruz, watching it come across the water. They didn't get caught in it in October with the wrong jacket and have to shelter under the awning of a bakery and watch it fall. And think about nothing in particular. They didn't learn that you can tell the difference between a squall and a system by the way it smells. They don't have stories about it. They don't have a god for it. We do. We have had a god for it for at least 1,000 years, probably longer. Maybe that's something. Maybe it's nothing. I keep coming back to it. She looked at the statue. The flat surface of the abdomen held the layered accumulation of what her unit had left there over the weeks. The photograph, the ration bar wrapper, the copper ring, the marigold, the private note, 2 more photographs. Tooth that Corporal Petch had lost to an infection and had left there with the grim humor of a man who has run out of more conventional options. I don't know if you can hear me, she said. I don't know if that's a question that has a coherent answer. But if you can, tomorrow we're going to try to take the sky back. We might not make it, but someone should know we tried. Someone should remember that we were here and we tried. She turned off the hand torch. In the darkness, the sublevel was not silent. The generator ran, the recycler churned, the water moved along its patient paths across the floor. But it was close enough to silence that she could hear her own breathing. She went to sleep in her chair, which she had not done since the first week, and she dreamed of rain. The Tlaloc surface units were a class of drone-serviced mobile platform that the human forces had designated Lahar in the tactical database. After the volcanic mud flows, because they were heavy and they kept coming, and they did not negotiate, there were 12 of them on the grid above Tunnel Exit 7 when Reyes's unit came up, which was 6 more than intelligence had suggested, which was the kind of discrepancy that makes experienced soldiers very tired. The carrier spike lasted 31 seconds. Villanueva ran it from the relay panel in the tunnel junction, with Reyes's authorization code in his left hand and a rosary in his right. She saw and did not mention. The spike went out. The Tlaloc array went dark. The pressure gradient, 6 weeks of accumulated atmospheric manipulation, began to uncoil. The rain came down like a wall. Reyes had expected something impressive. She had seen Villanueva's models. She had run the pressure numbers herself. She had still not been prepared for the sound of it, which was not the sound of rain, but the sound of a river, arriving sideways, full weight of 6 weeks, of atmospheric suppression releasing in 3 minutes, through a sky that had forgotten how to hold it. The Lahar units slowed. Their sensor arrays, designed for the precise and managed atmosphere the harvesters maintained, overloaded by the density of the precipitation. The targeting data became noise. Their compensating algorithms ran and produced nothing useful. Because there was nothing useful to produce, the conditions had moved outside the envelope they had been designed for. Corporal Valentina Reyes, who had grown up in Oaxaca and knew what a serious rainstorm looked like, was the first one to the surface. She came up through the tunnel mouth into the sideways rain with her rifle up, and her helmet systems running on passive mode, because active sensors, as useless to her in this precipitation as the Lahar units' targeting arrays were to them, and she aimed by line of sight and intuition and 8 years of muscle memory. And she began working. The 14 functional infantry of the 3rd Combat Engineering Battalion came up behind her and fanned left and right. Private Quispy, who was the youngest, and in some ways the least experienced, and in other ways had already seen things that should have broken him, and hadn't, went left with Corporal Petch toward the flank position, and Reyes heard him singing something under his breath that she couldn't identify until later, when she asked him, and he said it was a song his grandmother had sung about a river coming down from the mountains and taking everything it needed and giving back what it chose. The Lahar unit recovered in 2 minutes and 14 seconds, which was 31 seconds less than Villanueva's most conservative estimate, which was the kind of discrepancy that also makes experienced soldiers very tired. 2 minutes and 14 seconds of targeting blindness in a precision weapons platform is an enormous gift, and Reyes's unit used it with the particular creativity of people who have been underground for 6 weeks, with nothing but time and fear and ingenuity. They did not win the battle above Tunnel Exit 7 in a clean or a glorious way. 4 people were injured, 2 seriously. They held the exit for 3 minutes and 12 seconds until the uncontrolled precipitation event ended, and the Tlaloc array began its recalibration, and the surface became untenable again. Then they went back down. But the carrier spike had gone out through the tunnel network to every relay point, in the grid, and in 17 other locations across the city. 14 other units had done versions of the same thing, with the same window, and same rain, and the aggregate effect on the Tlaloc atmospheric array was not recoverable in a day or a week, and that was the beginning. The way it actually ended was slower and uglier, and less satisfying than any version of events that a story would tell, because the way things actually end is almost never satisfying in the way stories are supposed to be satisfying. There were another 4 months of tunnel warfare and relay spike operations, and 17 more people from the 3rd Combat Engineering Battalion who died, and eventually the Tlaloc's atmospheric array degraded past the threshold where the harvesters could maintain cohesion, repositioned. And the rain became weather again. Reyes wrote the last entry in her log on the day they came up into daylight for the first time in 4 months and stood on a street in Mexico City with their faces up and felt actual sunlight, inconsistent and ordinary, and not manufactured by anything, she wrote. Someone will write about this differently later. Someone will make it clean and purposeful, find the narrative of it, and impose the beginning, middle, end. They'll say we found the weakness in the array, which is true, and they'll say we exploited it, which is also true, and they'll say we won, which is more or less true, in the way that surviving something until it ends is a form of winning. They won't mention the offerings on the altar. They won't mention Quispy, singing in the rain on the way up, through the tunnel mouth. They won't mention Villanueva's rosary or Peck's tooth or the private note that is still on the stone tray and that I have never read. They won't mention that I kept a log. They won't mention the face on the statue and what I thought I saw in it. Those things happened. They're the part that actually happened. In the specific way that the human things are always the part that actually happened, and everything else is the context for them. The statue is going back to the museum when the museum is rebuilt. The team that assessed the cultural materials from Sector 9 said it's one of the finest examples of pre-classical carving in the collection, possibly the finest. They're going to put it in the main hall, well-lit, proper platform, with a placard explaining its age and provenance and likely ritual function. I'm glad. It should be seen. But I'll know something the placard won't say, is that it spent 4 months in a flooded sublevel with 14 frightened soldiers, who left it a ration bar and a copper ring and a tooth, and a photograph and a dried flower and a note. And something looked back at us from the stone, and we were not alone. I don't know if that's why we made it. I'm not making that claim. I know what the carrier spike did, and I know what the pressure gradient did, and I know what Villanueva's math did, and I know what 14 people with rifles and 8 seconds of clear targeting and 2 minutes of chaos did. I know how we won. But I also know we went down into the dark and found something made by human hands 1,000 years ago and brought it with us, and we left it offerings, and we talked to it in the dark, and we came up out of the ground and into the rain. And somewhere up there, in the reconfiguring Tlaloc arrays, some process that passes for intelligence among their kind ran its models again on what had happened and found that the variance from the predicted outcome was, I would like to believe this, I'm not sure if it's true, larger than any variance their models had previously recorded. Because we made something, and the things we make remember us. And we remember them. She closed the log. She put her face up into the October sunlight, which was thin and insufficient and absolutely ordinary. She stood there for a long time, eyes closed, feeling it. Above her, Mexico City was taking stock of itself, counting what remained. Around her, the soldiers of the 3rd Combat Engineering Battalion stood in the light with the slightly stunned expressions of people who have been proven wrong about something important, who had believed, at some level, that this was how it ended, down in the dark, and who were now adjusting their expectations. Quisp was sitting on a chunk of concrete with his rifle across his knees, looking at a sky that was going orange. At the edges, the particular October orange that this latitude produced, when the air was clear and the light was low. He looked younger in the sunlight. He looked like what he was, which was 20 years old and not broken. Reyes stood with her face up for another moment. Then she went to find Villanueva. Because there was work to do. There was always work to do. And the 3rd Combat Engineering Battalion was going to need to account for its expenditures and its casualties and its equipment states in a formal report that someone would read and file and possibly, someday, read again. She would write it correctly. She would write it precisely, the way she always wrote things. And then she would go see what they were going to do with the statue.